Hey everybody, this is Perch. If you've been collecting reading comics for any length of time, and this may be, I'm going to need some people to help me out in the comments here because I'm not sure if this is a feeling or a situation that's really happened to people. If you're newer to comics, if you started collecting in the last like 5, 10 years, you may not have the same impression about this than I do. Um, I'm very positive that people who've been collecting comics for more than 10 years have had this experience, and you hear it all the time in the shop. And it's basically where you're following along on a comic, a storyline, a team, a character, whatever it happens to be. And then the series gets canceled. And there's a number of plot threads and other things that just kind of vanish into thin air. Alternatively, you could be like Chris Claremont moves off the X-Men. John Byrne briefly takes over as writer, but then the title moves on, and that's another situation where it was just he had a lot of different little subplots and things spinning that seemed to disappear. Now, right now, Marvel's doing this X-Men Legends thing, which in theory is supposed to kind of tie up some of those loose ends or go back and try to address some of these continuity gaps. And based on the sales, it's been popular. It's been something that people have gotten excited about and has helped them kind of reimagine or re-come to some of these titles. But overall, if you've been reading comics for any length of time, there's this kind of graveyard of storylines, characters, and ideas that just disappear. They go into nowhere. And the consequence to that. One of the reasons why I said that I think that people who are newer to comics may not have the same experience is now a lot of writers are doing a lot less with subplots and teeing things up and getting a bunch of things moving. They're because they know the title could be either canceled or they could get removed relatively quickly. So they're not even trying to bring some of these things up. There's been a lot of commentary around writing for the trade, which typically means writing in 6-issue arcs, so you get like a complete story within one trade. But a kind of a subplot to that, or a connected piece to writing for the trade, is that you don't introduce things in the comic that are not basically explained or paid off inside the single volume trade. Or if you do, it's extremely minimal. Claremont would tease, I mean, there were jokes made about the amount of subplots and spinning plates he had going, things that would come up and not get paid off for years in some cases. And that was just a part of kind of 80s storytelling. And I think if you were a fan of comics in the 80s, you came to love, and that was one of the fun parts about comics, was keeping track of all these different plot threads and these different angles and everything else that was going on. That was kind of part of the fun. Today, it's pretty much non-existent, and I'm actually curious if they suddenly started doing this, how would people respond? My feeling is, based on successes of titles like Invincible and Walking Dead and even Saga to some extent, my feeling, the indies have really taken up that torch, and people have responded really, really well to it. But Marvel and DC have largely walked away from it. And again, it's a lot of just how they've kind of trained over time their writers to behave, to create stories. The value is in one trade. The editors are trained to kind of not do those things. What's weird is in at least the halls of Marvel, I do, even as recently as like a couple months ago, you would still hear expressions like, remember Jim Shooter said every comic could be someone's first comic, so don't start too many plots, which, as I've said in previous videos, is a gross warping of what that statement from Shooter meant. But it's really, again, you don't have long-lasting storylines or things in comics anymore. So 2 questions here. So number one, does anybody miss this as much as I do? I absolutely miss it. I think comics had a much bigger depth, and there was more payoff. And quite frankly, I found myself reading through arcs I didn't really care for because I wanted to see how they're going to pay off a subplot. In some cases, the subplot was what got you really excited for the next issue, or beyond that. That was what was very exciting. And I think we've largely walked away from that. I think whatever value people think they're getting for writing a one trade and done style story over 5 or 6 issues. I think the value is less than the kind of getting a reader hooked on this title for the long term. So that's kind of the first piece. I think it's one of when I think about what are the big things that have changed about comics. To me, I mean, this is where I argue with people, and I think this is where some of the fin sitting comments come in and everything else. But regardless, I don't think political ideology, whatever that means exactly, is the big culprit. To me, if I'm like doing the top 5 things that really went sideways or are not as good as they used to be, it's subplots is definitely up there. The ability to have kind of long running threads, long running arcs. Constantly changing out the writer and the artist is another one. Constantly relaunching is another one. Having no clear villains, like no really powerful, threatening villains anymore. This is my list. But anyway, subplots is high up there. It's a big one. The other thing, though, I wanted to ask you is if, kind of like the X-Men Legends is trying to do, and this is where I'm wondering if there's kind of a aha moment for Marvel at some point, is the X-Men Legends series has been popular. And the takeaway that I gather is happening at Marvel is, well, of course it's popular. It's got kind of legendary names attached to it. Brett Booth is a seller. Luis and Walt Simonson are big name sellers. Peter David coming in to do X Factor again. Fabian Nacenta. These names are selling the book, and I agree. I do think that's a part of it. I absolutely do. But I also think it's a mix somewhere between nostalgia and just this feeling of completionist, wanting to complete a storyline, I think is driving it as much as the talent. I think if you put, competent, like good artists, I'm not talking about garbage people, but I mean good artists, good writers on this book, but not necessarily famous ones, just people who, were turning in a solid comic. I think it would do. It wouldn't do quite as well because I think people are coming in for the name, but I think it would still do pretty well. Because I do think you've got this collector mentality. People like to finish their stories. They like to actually get, they like to have things finished that they start. I think that's human nature. It's normal. It's normal behavior. And so I'm curious if comic companies were to do more of this. I mean, granted, an editor, I sounded very fancy there, an editor and a creative team could easily, go across a lineup at Marvel or DC and have enough stories, enough basic fill in the blank kind of comics, enough, we'll finish these stories that have never been finished. There's enough to do that for half dozen titles for years. There's so many outstanding storylines that if you had untold tales of the Marvel universe, you could complete some of this stuff every week for 2 or 3 years and not run out of material. And I tend to think it would be popular, even if it wasn't the X-Men. I do think people like this sense of conclusion. And so I come to all this by saying kind of a couple things. One, I feel like the comic companies, particularly the big two, although this is a case where the indies seem to be picking up the torch and running with it, subplots and these kind of longer running arcs, I think are a big deal. And I think they're necessary. They're certainly desirable. I think they're necessary. And number two, I think there's a business in there for companies to basically pick up these plots and do more with them and kind of learn from the X-Men Legends example. Again, not get tricked by thinking it's just a creative team. Although now I will say I do wonder if X-Men Legends has kind of spoiled things by basically you put bigger names on the title at the beginning, and so now there's an expectation that's been built up. But regardless, I think there's a lot of money in there, and I think people would go for it, and I think it would, in many cases, quiet and answer a lot of complaints that comic companies have about not respecting the past and not acknowledging some of what's come before. I do think that there's a big business there. I think there's a definite there's definitely value. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Would you buy such a comic? Is that something that entertains you? One thing I will say, one more caveat to add on to this. I am not talking about putting a comic out today and retconning previous stuff. I mean, part of, fulfilling these abandoned storylines, or these things that, canceled titles never got to complete. Part of it is you can't go back and like kind of reverse engineer the characters. Like if you're, for example, if you're doing a fill-in plot from an X-Men story from the 60s, from the very, very early time, you shouldn't go in there and while you're kind of completing this storyline that got dropped, also like have, Bobby Drake go out on dates with guys like that. That wasn't part of the storyline at the beginning. I'm not talking about filling in missing blanks. I'm literally talking about completing stories. So you can't use it as a way to kind of push some of what you're doing today. It's truly a completion mark. I think if that's a whole other topic for that matter. But generally, I think if you're going to retcon something, you shouldn't, basically start new issues and try and go back and fix some of that stuff. I don't think that's very cool at all. Not what people are asking for, but maybe I'm wrong about that too. So let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe, and thanks for listening.